Thank you very much, Scott. Thank you for involving me in this. I'm really impressed with the crowd today, and I was in the morning sessions really impressed with the information that's being passed out. And David, always a pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with you, and also to get a chance to just speak off the cuff and just be open and honest and share your views on some important industry issues.
Thanks, Luke.
Now, I've been doing a little bit of research on you in preparing for this, and you certainly have been around a while, more than 30 years. A couple of things that I noted in your first year with the OTA to show you it was a while ago. Ronald Reagan was just being sworn in for his second term of office. Michael Gorbachev was just becoming the leader of the Soviet Union. Microsoft was releasing its first version of Windows. We were about to play Nintendo for the first time, and we were listening to Like a Virgin from Madonna.
And
not to make you
I
feel
wasn't
old.
a virgin at that time.
So you're going to be stepping down in 2017. I just wanted to ask you, was it a tough decision, or was it a case where you had that Pierre Trudeau-like moment of walking in the snow and you knew this was the right time?
Yeah, I took a walk in Rexdale and got mugged, and I realized it was time to move on. No, it was and is a very hard decision. You know, I've said it a million times that I have loved every moment of the last 31, 32 years, whatever it is, and that's absolutely true. And I really can't put my finger on why I think next year's the time, other than I think your mind and your body start sending you signals, and I think we've had a really good run. We've got a really good team of younger folks, and I think it's their turn. You know, the industry's changing for the better, I do think. And it's time for some fresh ideas and new ideas. But thanks for that requiem, making me feel older than I am, even. Ronald Reagan.
Well, speaking of the industry changing, when you came into the industry, this was an industry that was still regulated. Still, competition was rather stifled as a result. U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement still not signed. Satellite communications in trucks still on the drawing board. Now you leave an industry that is deregulated, highly competitive. Carriers have had to respond to traffic patterns that are changing as a result of national and international trade agreements. And of course now we're in an onslaught of new technologies. In your mind, is the industry better off because of all these changes, or, like some people say, it'd be better to go back to the old days?
Well, you're always going to get people say better off to go back to the old days. I do think that when I first came on board, it very much was a closed shop and sort of a club, and it was easy to make money. And I don't think that's good for any industry, and I think the industry wasn't even considered an industry at that time, and it's had to change, and it's had to turn itself around on a dime so many times, and that's what's been exciting for me. It's such a dynamic business. Anything that affects the economy, political structures here around the world somehow has an impact on freight patterns, the level of traffic, and therefore the trucking industry. And I think that's exciting. And people say it's a staid, mature, gray business, and that may be true in some respects. But at the same time, I've just seen the industry be able to turn itself around so many times that's really remarkable. I can't imagine a more difficult business than trucking, when you consider all of the factors at play that you have to deal with on a daily basis, and yet people still love it, and you survive it, and that's amazing. There's a lot easier ways, I'm sure, to make a living, but the people in this industry are really special, And that's what's kept me going.
You know, one of the things that I noticed when I first came into the industry, a little after you, was that at the time, in the late '80s, if you weren't over 40, white, and male, you basically weren't supposed to say anything. I've seen a real difference just in the last few years in terms of the voices that are being heard in the industry, and I think the OTA and CTA have really been playing a leading role in trying to get more voices from more different people, different communities involved in the industry.
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing. You know, I think we have to reflect Canada and reflect society. And perhaps it was an industry that wasn't attractive or wasn't as opening and welcoming as it could and should have been. And I do think that there was this view, you know, unless you were born and raised in the industry, you didn't know anything. And therefore you weren't really welcome. That, I think, is one thing that has changed. And I think the industry is much more open and receptive now to different ideas from different disciplines. And I think it's had to be, because people have had to run their companies more like businesses than they've ever had to before. But from an association perspective, it comes down purely and simply to survival. If you're not, for the longer term, reflecting the mosaic that's the industry, then you're not going to survive, whether that's based on age, ethnic lines, whatever the case may be, type of carriers that are out there, the emerging businesses. If you're not reflecting all of those in your membership, then you're going to become a club, and a club that's not going to survive for very long.
Let's speak about some of the issues that we haven't been quite as successful in solving over the past 20, 30 years. First thing that comes to mind is making trucking a more attractive profession for those that want to be behind the wheel. Compensation is a part of this, and I know since deregulation that compensation has been an issue. Since we're not likely to go back to a regulated environment, how do we solve this problem that we've had for 25 years or so? I know one of the very first stories that I wrote was about the lack of the shortage of qualified drivers, and we're still keep writing that story over and over again. Is there a solution? Why does it keep evading us for so long? It's certainly not from lack of trying.
Well, you talk about going back. In my first few months back in 1985, I wrote an article on the future driver shortage. I'm an economist by training, and so I looked at some of the demographic trends that were evident back in the mid-1980s, and it was all predictable what we're confronting now, not just in trucking, but across the board in terms of the labor force. You know, it's a very difficult problem. Trucking is a very fragmented business, hyper-competitive business that's had no price leadership to speak of for the last 30 years. We've passed on all the efficiency and productivity gains that the industry has made to the customer in terms of pricing. And that's what deregulation was supposed to be all about. So in that sense, it worked. It increased competition, it kept transportation costs low, but a lot of companies have been allowed to grow and prosper in that environment where they would not have been able to in the regulated environment. So for the way I've looked at things, I'm not a patient person naturally. I get frustrated. I'm very much type A. Let's get it done. If it makes sense, let's do it. But I've had to learn a certain element of patience and take a longer-term view of things. And I do think that particularly in the last 10 years, that we've started to make some strides in terms of being a little more honest with ourselves within the industry in terms of where the problem is and ultimately where the solution is. And I think in both cases, the problem and the solution is in this room. And nobody else is going to fix it for us. Yes, governments can help us, and associations can help us in terms of, for example, mandatory entry-level training should be a precursor to getting the occupation of truck driving deemed to be recognized as a true skilled occupation or a trade, which will open up a whole other array of tools that perhaps we haven't had in the past. And there's other things like that that we can do. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the marketplace is going to fix this problem one way or the other. And markets don't always move in the same direction. They go up and down, as we have seen. But I do think that with the level of sophistication that's in the industry, when I started, there were literally 2 vice presidents of human resources in the entire industry across Canada. That's changed. Now, it's still not perhaps where it should be, but that's changed. And you look at the session this morning, you have a filled room of not CEOs and presidents, but people whose day-to-day responsibility is to deal with this sort of stuff. And I think that's a good thing. It'll take some time still, but when I look back to, say, the CTA Blue Ribbon Task Force on the driver shortage, I mean, one could be critical of it and say, okay, what have you really accomplished? Have you solved the driver shortage? No. But that wasn't what it was really about. It was to lay the foundations for future efforts, and so that we had at least a mutual direction. And I heard from a lot of drivers who said, the proof will be in the pudding in terms of whether the industry actually solves these issues while we're still employed in the industry or in our lifetime. But at least the report was honest in saying where the problems are. And I think that's the start. If you keep denying where the problems are, or if you keep blaming the shipper for it all, we're not going to solve things.
Well, you're right that the progress is being made, and certainly there are fleets across Canada that are doing some incredible things on the HR side. At the same time, when we hear of large fleets with turnover of over 100%, and I understand most of those would be in the U.S., but we do have high turnover rates in Canada as well. When we hear of numbers like that, can we legitimately say that we have a driver shortage, or is it really a problem that we can find people, we just don't treat them well enough to keep them?
Well, yeah, I mean that's an issue, and of that churn rate, it's interesting in terms of the turnover. If we could break it out by how many leave the industry versus just go somewhere else, we tend to churn them around within the industry, and I guess it's a good question. When do you have a shortage? We always qualify things. Well, it's a quality shortage or qualified driver shortage, and all of that's true too. But the demographics are stark. We could talk about quality and all of that sort of stuff, but we're just going to have a pure shortage of warm bums to put in the seat. And it's really going to behoove us to make the investment as an industry in human capital to the same extent that we've made it in other capital investments, whether that's in your equipment, your warehousing. You're going to have to make as big an investment to have just as much discipline and innovation and approach to how you come up with human capital as you do for everything else. And that's, that would tell me that there has been, while the demographics have been moving towards a shortage, that for most of the last 30 years, other than at certain short periods of time where things really tightened up, we've suffered from an excess of capacity. And you look now and things there's some slack in the economy these days. So, I think if you ask most people in the room today, they'd say, well, we don't have necessarily a shortage of drivers. Again, they might say, boy, but we could use some good drivers. And all that tells me is we're going to have to invest more in training. The kids coming off the farm, out of the military, wherever we used to get them in the past, who are used to being around machinery and like this kind of lifestyle, that just doesn't exist anymore. So if we want to make these people safe, whatever skill level they have, we're going to have to supplement that with more training and with technology. Now the old guard are going to say, oh, we don't need that, we're great drivers. Well, that may very well be, but you know, the clock's ticking on them, and the folks coming in, it's a different breed.
You emphasize that this is a problem the industry is going to have to solve for itself. No one else is going to jump in and solve it for us. One of the things that the industry has wanted for quite some time, and the OTA and CTA have been pushing for quite some time, is making driving a skilled trade. What's missing in the dialogue with government? Why haven't we been able to make more progress on this front?
Well, I don't know, to be fair, I don't know that the problem is with government on this. If you want the occupation to be deemed skilled, it has to take on the attributes of other skilled occupations. And we might quibble with what some of the criteria are, but you know, when I drive down the highway and I see a trailer with a sticker on it advertising for truck drivers and saying no education required, that's not indicative of a skilled or even a semi-skilled occupation. You know, we don't have, or we will soon, any compulsory training required. You can walk in off the street and get your Class A or your Class 1 if you're from somewhere else, and the test has been at such a level that you probably will pass it if you've had any instruction at all. That's not indicative of a skilled occupation. The fact that we don't have a formal ongoing lifetime training program is not indicative of a skilled occupation. Now there's lots of training going on out there, but we just don't document it. We have to play the game a bit more than we have been. We can say, oh yeah, well we do all that stuff. Well, who says? You say. We need to be able to demonstrate it as an industry. And the other thing is that, you know, I'm always torn between the role of associations in trying to fix problems on behalf of an industry, by the same token, allowing those companies who do a good job the competitive advantage they deserve as well. You know, is at the end of the day, Stan Dunford used to say, he who has the drivers wins. And so if somebody's doing a good job and they're getting the drivers, I'm not so sure they want their association mucking about making everybody else just as competitive. So there's always that balancing act we have to play. And you know, I think too, I'll be very honest, I mean the two issues that have plagued the industry through my 30 years, the rate structure and the driver issues, beyond shortage, driver issues, you know, there's not a hell of a lot associations can do about that. You know, we can come up with videos and put lipstick on the pig all you want, but it has to come from within the industry.
Your thoughts on Ontario's effort with the mandatory entry-level standard, the MELT?
I think it's great. This came out of, again, the CTA Blue Ribbon Task Force, and I see Mark Seymour standing there at the back of the room. Is that you, Mark? Yeah, and Mark is the chairman of that committee, and you know, they very early on, this was a group of a dozen or so CEOs from across the country, got together, and I tell you, it took some prodding too to get them opening up in terms of the problems. But one of the things they quickly identified was the fact, and this takes on a broad meaning about this issue of skilled and the perception, and how the job has in many respects become the job of last resort. If you can't do anything else, become a truck driver. Now that's not a good way to go out and attract people to the business when you're facing a shortage. So, and that was confirmed by the study that the conference board did at the time, and both the task force and the conference board said, look, you know, again, if you don't have some sort of mandatory entry-level training, you're not even in the game in terms of changing that perception and ultimately being able to change the classification. So, you know, in the scheme of things, it was about 2.5 years ago that we approached, at the time it was Glenn Murray was the Minister of Transportation and the Premier, and said, look, this is something we want. And, you know, there were a lot of questions. Well, why would you want to raise the bar at a time when you're facing a shortage? Mm-hmm. It's sort of counterintuitive. Well, we had to explain to them because we have the opportunity to attract youth, certainly, who for the first time are looking at, instead of getting a bugger all degree and being unemployed or living in their parents' basement, like all my kids have done who followed my path, to, you know, the great Canadian dream, to actually being employable. But if we aren't, again, if we don't take on those attributes of other trades, well, they're going to go get their ticket and become plumbers, electricians, and everything else. And that's exactly what's happening. I hear from the driving schools that out of the 10, every 10 candidates they have, I can't remember the exact number, but it's a high proportion of them, people who would be excellent candidates to be truck drivers, good quality people. They say, well, okay, where's the funding for my training? Well, there is no funding because we're not a trade, blah, blah, blah. Well, then they go off and do something else, and we're left with the 2 or 3 guys at the end of the day who can't do anything else. And then they don't get proper training, and then they come and knock on all the carriers' doors, and you just waste so much of your time and money and send them on their way. And then they end up phoning into talk radio shows giving me hell that you got a driver shortage, they got a license, they can't get a job. You know, it's just goes round and round and round. Yeah.
Well, we've got 10 minutes left, and there's a
I want to say one thing, you know, because I got a lot to say.
You're the boss.
You know, it's another trait that's sort of been frustrating in the industry. And again, most of the people that I deal with and anything we've accomplished has been because of the vision of our board of directors and our members. And they provide the inspiration for all of this. And then we make it happen or we don't make it happen and they fire our ass. But something I do find frustrating, and I read it in the pages of your periodicals, we get the phone calls, we get it in the call-in shows, is there's an element of the industry who really like to complain about everything, yes. You know, their lot in life, and that makes it really difficult when you're trying in the public eye to promote the industry. But that's a motivation for trying to fix things. But you know, whether it's some of the things, more controversial things we've taken on over the years, like speed limiters, like ELDs initially, like mandatory entry-level training. Oh my God, you think the world is going to fall in. But I find the people that complain the most about their lot in life in the industry are the ones who don't want to change anything. And you know, Albert Einstein said the definition of insanity is keep doing the same thing, right, and expect a different result. So, you know, I think that OTA and the members have really challenged the industry at times and stuck their neck out, and that takes guts. And it's been great to, you know, be able to try to give voice to that. And you know, those things didn't come from me. I don't set the policy. It's the members that set the policy, and it's been a really good thing. So for all the naysayers out there, you know, the world didn't come to an end when we brought in speed limiters. In fact, maybe you found you saved some money, and it won't come to an end with ELDs. It'll make things better, and it's going to only make things better with mandatory entry-level training too. Absolutely.
Well, you mentioned ELDs, and that's the next subject I wanted to touch on. You were certainly on the hot seat for being one of the leading proponents of ELDs. This legislation is coming, but I still get a lot of small fleets and certainly owner-operators who don't want to have anything to do with this. What is it that they're missing from this argument? What is it that you see that they don't, or is it a case, to be blunt, that they simply have an operation where they can't make money by running legal?
Well, or they think they can't make money by running legal. I think a lot of them think they make their money in their last 100 miles as opposed to in their first 100 miles. So there's that element. We went through the same thing with the speed limiters. I think it's a reflection of a number of things. And I'll say it's a lot less than it was 5 years ago, kind of thing. And I have yet to hear from a driver whose company has gone to ELDs where they actually now love it. And I hear from carriers saying, yeah, all we need is for the system to go down for 2 days to hear the drivers bitch in terms of how much they really like it. But I think it's more a combination of a couple of things. One is, there is very much an independent spirit in the industry, and that just naturally breeds concern about Big Brother and oversight and that sort of thing. And I can understand that completely, and we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that where governments are monitoring the industry, that it's for the right reasons, that it's using technology that doesn't require a lot of administration and that sort of thing. And I think ultimately at the end of the day, it can help to make markets work better, which arguably then everybody should make more money. But the other thing is, I think, and I don't think truckers are any different than the rest of society, most people just don't like change. And it's very difficult for them. But after you do change, you find out, hey, things weren't so bad. But I think that's what it is more than anything. The case is made in terms of, there are some routes where it's going to be more, and some businesses where it's going to become more difficult, but it just means we have to manage our businesses better. And that's the name of the game these days. It doesn't matter what business you're in, you got to be better. There's always somebody chomping at your heels. And if your economic model is to cheat, to use that expression, then you're giving away your service at a price that's less than the true cost. And those are probably some of the same people that bitch about the rates too. So we gotta take ownership of things, and if we don't like the way things are, then we've got to change something.
One of the issues that's a lot more prevalent today than it was 30 years ago is the issue of the environment. Wanted to ask, I've read in your columns that you would like to see Canada take a much more active role when it comes to not simply mirroring U.S. legislation. I'm talking here about fuel efficiency standards. That you'd like to see us come up with a Canadian approach rather than simply mirroring what's happening in the U.S. Why do you believe that? And could not someone make the argument that if we do that, we overcomplicate things for carriers that are running north-south?
Well, because I'm real pig-headed is why. One of the great things about my job has been that I've not only been able to visit every inch of Canada and meet people in the industry all over the place and every type of carrier, driver imaginable, but I've been able to travel the world too and get their perspectives on issues. And obviously, particularly for us, the United States. And I'll tell you, there are no truckers anywhere else in the world, in my view, that can hold a candle to the Canadian carriers. And when it comes to two things, safety and the environment, I think the industry here is 5 to 10 years ahead of the U.S. in terms of their thinking, and other parts of the world even further ahead than that. It's always, in my view, the Canadian carriers have always been much more focused on fuel economy than U.S. carriers. I've wondered why that is. It may be because at many times over the last 30 years, the price of fuel was higher in Canada and Ontario than it was in the U.S. Maybe because of the weather, we're just more conscious of these things. Maybe it's because we just have to work harder because our market isn't as dense as the U.S. on all facets of the business. So I've seen so many of our guys are early adopters of technologies and devices and innovative in terms of moving towards, call it the greener environment. And it makes sense. You want to reduce GHG, you improve your fuel economy. It's a win-win for everybody at that point. So I just don't think, whether it's environmental rules or whether it's the ELDs or whatever it is, that the Americans or anybody else has a monopoly on good ideas. And I don't think that Canadian laws should be developed by US Congress and all their political issues. We've got our own political issues here and our own markets here. So I do think that where it makes sense to harmonize, you harmonize. Where it makes sense to be aligned, sure, absolutely we should be. I mean, that just makes imminent sense. But I would much rather have a situation where we're sitting down developing true North American standards than have this false choice of, well, we'll take what the Americans do or nothing at all. And that to me makes no sense, because I think we've got some good ideas too. And that's one of the things that it was a failure of NAFTA. And this all started shortly after the agreement was signed, and the Americans unilaterally decided not to open the southern border. And there were all kinds of committees and subcommittees at that time that were dealing with trying to come up with true North American standards. That all went out the window. But in order for Canada to be a player, we have to have national positions. The Americans will not accept 10 different provinces and 3 territories version of the hours of service, of safety ratings, whatever else. So we've got to get our act together here, and then we've got to be at the table pounding away and fighting to make sure that we have things that truly make sense on a North American basis, not just that make sense for the hub and spoke economy in the US. And I think on the environmental one, what you're referring to is the phase 2 of the GHG regulations for heavy trucks. Well, Canada, the previous government, said, we're going to do what the Americans do. No more, no less. Well, maybe they got away with that in phase 1 because it wasn't a particularly innovative or aggressive regulation. But on the second round, it's going to include the tractor and the trailer. Well, the EPA developed their rule on the basis of the 80,000-pound tandem. We have those here. And guys going to the U.S. will use that weight, at least the U.S. weight when they go to the U.S. But we've got at least a dozen other common configurations here that when you look at it pound for pound, when you look at it on the basis of payroll, we're 23% more fuel efficient as a fleet and 23% less GHG. So why should we be measured against that one configuration? We have to be more sophisticated than that. Problem is, governments always look for the easy way. And on that regulation, they've said, we're just going to do what we did for cars. It's the same. Well, it's not the same. There are differences in the Canadian fleet compared to the US fleet. Where we cross the border, yes, compatible, harmonized. But, I don't know how the Americans are ever going to solve their environmental issues sticking at 80,000 pounds. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. But again, that's where their politics come into play. And if you look at governments here over certainly the last 5-10 years compared to the previous 10 years, there's been no problem getting productivity enhancements in terms of weights and dimensions from governments here. We have a formula, we follow it. As long as the thing makes sense from a dynamic performance standpoint, chances are they will accept. Now, it doesn't mean every province moves at the same pace, but we're moving, we're innovating. And, I know it's still probably in this room and certainly in the U.S. You watch the debate even within the industry in terms of truck weights and dimensions, and it's like the 1960s still. And oh gosh, if we improve our productivity, we're just going to be giving it all to the shipper. And then, well, not necessarily. You don't have to give it to the shipper. But when you look at Canada, we need to attract direct investment here. We want businesses locating here. That'll help everybody. So we've never viewed at OTA, the members have never viewed our job as stopping productivity in the economy. And I think it's a much healthier way to look at it than to say, oh gosh, I might have to go out and buy some new trailers if we do this. Well, those things can all be dealt with in terms of how you phase stuff in and whatnot. And again, I just think our guys have had to be better because of our market and because we have to compete with the Americans, and they're formidable competitors, and I think we do a damn good job of it. The fact that Canadian carriers have 70% of the traffic, north-south traffic across the border is testament to that.
Well, David, as always in these situations, I have the difficult task of having too many questions and not enough time.
And I talk too much.
but I really want to thank you for an enlightening discussion, and I think I speak for everyone here when I say we are really going to miss the knowledge that you bring and the passion that you bring.
Well, thank you. It's not time to say goodbye yet,
I know.
but until then, it's always a pleasure, Lou, and thanks for coming out. This is great. This is a real shot in the arm for OTA, and I hope you all learned something and take back and keep us on our toes too. So thanks very much to all of you.